You walk into a barn and see a pristine horse in a spotless stall. Polished tack, perfectly braided mane, zero dirt. It looks like a magazine cover. Then you walk to another barn and see horses covered in mud, rolling in pastures, hanging out in groups. Same species, completely different lives. Why do some people treat horses like living trophies? Isolating them in stalls, wrapping them in blankets they don't need, training them into unnatural gaits for aesthetics. While others let them live more like actual horses. The psychological cost isn't just on the human's chasing status. It's on the horses themselves. When owners prioritize prestige over nature, horses lose their 3 Fs: friends, forage, and freedom. They're kept alone instead of in herds. They're punished for behaviors misinterpreted through human lenses, called stubborn when they're in pain, lazy when they're stressed. And often, their welfare is sacrificed for aesthetics or performance. The relationship becomes hollow, not a partnership, but ownership driven by ego and external validation. So let's start with the fundamental question. What happens when you treat a living creature as an accessory? Because that's what we're really talking about here. Some horses live as performance objects, groomed to perfection, kept in controlled environments, trained to move in ways that look impressive but feel unnatural. They're investments, they're resume builders, they're Instagram content. And the problem isn't that people care about how their horses look. It's that the horse's subjective experience becomes secondary to the owner's image. Research in animal behavior shows that horses are highly social creatures who've evolved to live in stable groups with complex hierarchies. They need social contact, not just for companionship, but for emotional regulation. When a horse gets nervous, it looks to other horses for cues about whether the threat is real. When a horse is isolated in a stall for 22 hours a day, it's being deprived of one of its most fundamental psychological needs. And the justification is often, "My horse is too valuable to risk injury in turnout." Translation: "My financial investment matters more than this animal's mental health." Think about what that does over time. Horses kept in isolation develop what's called stereotypic behaviors, repetitive, purposeless actions like crib biting, weaving, or stall walking. These aren't quirks, they're coping mechanisms. They're what the nervous system does when it's chronically stressed and has no outlet. It's the equine equivalent of pacing in a prison cell. And owners often treat these behaviors as problems to be suppressed rather than symptoms of a deeper welfare issue. They'll install anti-cribbing devices or punish the horse for weaving instead of asking, "Why is my horse so stressed that it needs to do this?" Now let's talk about anthropomorphism, projecting human emotions and motivations onto animals. This cuts both ways. On one hand, treating your horse like a friend or family member can deepen your bond and increase your investment in their well-being. On the other hand, it can lead to wildly inaccurate interpretations of behavior. You see your horse refuse a jump and think, "He's being stubborn. He's testing me. He knows what I'm asking, and he's choosing to disobey." But horses don't have that kind of moral framework. They don't choose to be difficult. They respond to pain, fear, confusion, or conflicting cues. When you interpret resistance as defiance, you miss the actual problem, and you punish the horse for communicating distress. Studies on equine cognition show that horses are incredibly good at learning associations and reading body language, but they don't have the capacity for spite or manipulation. When a horse acts badly, it's almost always because something is wrong, physically or emotionally, or because the training wasn't clear. But owners who view their horses through a human lens often respond with frustration or discipline instead of investigation. And this creates a feedback loop. The horse's stress increases. The behavior worsens. The owner gets more punitive. The relationship deteriorates. There's also an economic layer to this. Horses are expensive. For many owners, they're the biggest discretionary expense in their budget. And when you've sunk tens or hundreds of thousands into an animal, there's psychological pressure to see that investment pay off. Maybe that means showing in prestigious competitions. Maybe it means posting photos that get likes. Maybe it means comparing your horse favorably to others. The horse becomes a reflection of your status, your taste, your success. And when that happens, the horse's needs get filtered through the question, does this serve my goals? This is where welfare gets compromised in subtle ways. Maybe you keep your horse in heavy work, even when they're showing signs of fatigue, because you've paid for a show and you're not going to withdraw. Maybe you use gadgets or techniques that create a specific look, like forcing a head position or creating exaggerated movement, because that's what wins. Maybe you limit turnout because you don't want your horse to get scratched or dirty before a competition. Each individual decision might seem minor, but cumulatively, they add up to a life where the horse's preferences and natural behaviors are systematically overridden. Research on animal welfare increasingly emphasizes the concept of positive welfare, not just the absence of suffering, but the presence of positive experiences. It's not enough for a horse to be fed, sheltered, and pain-free. They also need opportunities for natural behaviors like grazing, socializing, playing, and making choices. When horses are managed primarily for aesthetics or performance, those opportunities shrink. The horse becomes a passive recipient of care rather than an active participant in its own life. Here's a practical example. Wild horses spend 60 to 70% of their day grazing. Domestic horses, fed concentrated meals twice a day, might spend only 2 to 3 hours eating. That leaves massive stretches of time where the horse has nothing to do. Boredom isn't trivial. It's a welfare issue. A bored horse is an understimulated horse, and understimulation leads to frustration, anxiety, and the stereotypic behaviors we talked about earlier. But providing constant access to forage doesn't look as clean or controlled as scheduled feeding. It's messier. It's harder to monitor intake. So convenience and aesthetics win over the horse's psychological needs. So what's the takeaway? If you own a horse, ask yourself honestly, am I making decisions based on what's best for this animal, or based on what serves my image, goals, or convenience? If your horse could design their own life, would it look anything like the life you're providing? And if the answer makes you uncomfortable, that discomfort is valuable. It means you're willing to see the gap between your intentions and the reality your horse experiences. And that's the first step toward closing it. Because at the end of the day, horses didn't ask to be status symbols. They're just trying to be horses. And they deserve owners who let them.